people here tonight at Heinrich-Böll Foundation on behalf of the foundation, but also on behalf of our cooperation partners in this event, the Leibniz Forschungsverbund, the Research Alliance, Value of the Past, and the Max Weber Foundation. I would like to cordially welcome you to this event. This is a public debate which is part of a 3-day conference and event that is taking place here at the foundation. We have invited lots of historians and political scholars, and we are talking about right-wing historical myths and the reinterpretation of history by right-wing forces. And I would like to give the floor to Jacqueline Albrecht, Philipp Albrecht, Jan Philipp Albrecht in a minute, and I hope you will enjoy the evening.
Einen schönen guten Abend auch von meiner Seite. Herzlich willkommen.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to Heinrich Böll Foundation. I'm Jan Philipp Albrecht, one of the two chairpersons of the foundation, and I'm very happy to have you here, to have the whole conference here at our premises. And I would like to also express my gratitude to all those who have organized this event, which is the Referat Zeitgeschichte and their head, but also the technical team. It was worthwhile, and I'm happy to have you here. Historical narratives which refer to an allegedly extraordinary past and which transport traditional ideas, right-wing ideas, and gender role perceptions are experiencing a renaissance in Germany, in Europe, and abroad. History and the reinterpretation of history has always been a strategy characterized by mythization, but also by not referring or not speaking about certain aspects, and fake news, of course. But today, we do see this phenomenon getting ever stronger, which is also due to the fact that it is easy to spread those facts or news via social media. Reference to history has also changed. In the past, right-wing people were rather revisionist or negative. Today, you have AfD politicians who just go and say that the Nazi crimes were just an accident in an otherwise by honor, by a history which was otherwise characterized by honor in Germany. The instrumentalization history as a tool by the right wing is a danger to democracy, and it legitimizes discrimination, anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and it undermines democracy. So it's high time, and it's the right moment for democratic forces in society and in academia dedicate their knowledge to the exploration of history. And this is the reason why we are so happy to have an opportunity to give an impulse tonight here at Heinrich Böll Foundation. And we are also very happy that we can open this space for this very debate. I think it's important that political foundations offer this space so that historians and scholars come together and talk about history and the reinterpretation of history. And that's why we are happy about the revision of history experts meeting. And tonight I'm looking forward to tonight's event. And I'm happy to welcome Frank Bösch, historian and director of the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, and Constanze Itzel, director of the House of European History in Brussels. It's worthwhile visiting this institution, and I'm also happy to welcome Katja Meyer, member of the Saxon State Parliament and former Saxon State Minister of Justice, and for Democracy, Europe and Equality for the Alliance 90 and the Greens, and Volker Weiss, a historian and journalist who will offer the keynote tonight. But I would like to also thank Christine Watti of Deutschlandfunk, who will be our host tonight, and I'm happy to give her the floor.
Ja, auch von mir herzlich willkommen. Vielen Dank für die Überleitung. Jan-Philipp Albrecht.
A very warm welcome also from my side, and thank you for your words. Jan-Philipp Albrecht, you have heard now what we will talk about, and actually the different perspectives are particularly interesting, and that's what we would like to talk about. The different perspectives of the panel should be particularly interesting in order to talk about the emergence and significance of historical reinterpretations of historical revisionism and how to deal with it. History plays an important role, and maybe talking about history and communicating history is getting ever more important. So you will be with us for a few hours, and I'm happy to welcome all of you who are here tonight, and I'm looking forward to an exchange between politics, research, and knowledge transfer. And we would like to also give the audience an opportunity to take the floor. So we will talk for hours, and afterwards you can take the floor too. No, I'm just joking. But anyway, there will be a Q&A session for all those who are in this hall. If they want to add something, if they want to ask questions, they would be cordially invited, or they will be cordially invited to do so. And I'm happy to welcome also all those who are following us in the live stream, and we will start off with a contribution by Volker Weiss, a historian and journalist. And actually, he doesn't like us to say, please be brief, but we only have 10 or 15 minutes for you. You will talk about historical myths, and what we will talk about tonight is going to be based on what you offer in terms of an input.
Ja, guten Abend. Ich bin jetzt irritiert.
Good evening. I mean, I'm confused. We have hours, or should I be brief? I was told I should be brief. So let me start right away, and I will get straight to the point. I would like to begin with an excerpt from a historical political lecture given by Götz Kubitschek, one of the organizers of the so-called New Right, a man working behind the scenes, and he gave this speech during the European election campaign in 2024. He did so in order to support his candidate, Maximilian Krah, but then the two men quarreled. But before, he wanted to offer his support, and he declares war on critical historiography and formulates all the elements of a historical political offensive or campaign. So let's have a look at this video. We will see an excerpt so that you get an idea of the sound and the way people in this milieu speak.
Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, Maximilian Krah has become the leading candidate of the AfD in Saxony. And in the last months, he moved on two levels. He wrote a book with the title Politik von Rechts, and this is where he explained his idea of a right-wing policy in different fields. Politik von Rechts is in the 4th edition right now, but of course it will never be a book to really reach the masses. ZDF von Traal made a film about this book, and they quoted from his book in order to tell the better educated audience how horrible this alternative political program is. And of course, this was the strategy of provocation, but this is not about masses, and this is not about emotional access either. Now, the most suggestive part of the political motion is rather to be found in another format, and Krah has been working with this format. This is TikTok videos of lengths of 1 minute max. Now, he has a professional team, and these are messages delivered to young people. And they seem to be spontaneous, like someone is just having a camera at hand, a mobile phone, and he is speaking. This is the idea he wants to give, the impression. Statements he shows and begin with a sentence, our ancestors were no criminals, and this is how his statements end too. And he proposes that young people talk to their grandparents, and he invites his audience to not be manipulated by others. So you really have to deal with your ancestors. There is no deep moral gap between them and you. Now, these are videos, and they do not really help you offer a clear analysis, but people watch them. Hundreds of thousands of people watch these videos. They polarize. And on the one hand, people get angry about these videos. On the other hand, they feel relieved. They like it. Because all of a sudden, life becomes much stronger and much more powerful than each ideology. Krah said, this is one moment of liberation, and it helps us get back to normality. You feel the effort of your opponent, of the enemy who always talks about the people of perpetrators. The Germans are still vulnerable in view of these interpretations of history. No way open to normalcy is the message. Now, the reactions show that Krah is really entering one of the taboo spaces of the Republic. Poisoning the past through moralizing narratives of history are the foundations of our Republic, is the thesis. But you have to nip it in the bud, is what people say. And this was one of the most powerful arms in the debates about sovereignty and the interests of a German people based on the origin of its very being German. In the past, we've thus been dealing with one of the most powerful propaganda narratives. The concepts, Deutsches Volk, German people, right-wing, guilt, the Holocaust, are very emotional, and they are closely connected. They are linked, and it's impossible to rationally dissolve the link. However, this dissolution is needed because this connection is a toxic one, and this would be the normality our country needs. It sounds normal if people are not forced to make statements. Alice Weidel showed the same when being asked why, on the day of the German capitulation, she did not join the celebrations in the Russian embassy. She said, now the defeat of my own country should not be celebrated with the former occupation force. I decided for myself, also in view of the history of flight of my father, that I don't want to participate, I don't want to join this celebration. The media copied each other. They said everybody was angry about Weigel's statement because this would fall behind what President Weizsäcker said in 1985, i.e. 8th May was the day of liberation. Really? I mean, was this the statement he made? Isn't this, like everything, a matter of perception or of your perspective? Now, in order to really impose new perspectives, you need to win the propaganda battle. We, that's the right-wing movement, are storming and overcoming and toppling thinking blockades and the ban on swords. We try to find alternatives there where people say there shouldn't be an alternative option. The things that cannot be said have to be said because they could be thought. They could always be thought and said, but only because of the consequences, because of fear. People did not speak up. So it's simple once it's done. And it's very important to find the propaganda means. Right, so far you have understood that Kubitschek considers himself a leading force, toppling barricades and fighting. And in the context of the Shoah, he says the concepts of Deutsches Volk, right-wing, Holocaust, and guilt are connected, are wired, as if there were no historical events behind them, but rather a purely discursive operation that could now be dissolved in counter-discourse, a new way of understanding the theory. But this is normal in this particular movement, in this milieu. His normality is one in which there is no longer any connection between Germany and the Shoah. Now, this attitude is a very old one, and it was already put in words after the war and repeated later by people like David Hogan, Armin Mohler, Bernhard Wilms, and Hans-Dietrich Sander and others repeatedly. However, it was getting increasingly difficult for the right wing to convince others, and for these reasons, the controversy surrounding Weizsäcker's speech of 1985 was a key event for all nationalist circles. It was just a reaction to the fact that they had lost the capacity of convincing also the bourgeoisie of their particular historiography. So this was the situation as it was in 1985 and later. And then another book was published in 2017, became a bestseller for the publisher. Finis Germania is the title, by Rolf Peter Sieferle, and he proposed the idea that the Germans were actually the negatively selected people by historiography and had thus taken over the role of the Jews in the history of the world. So this was a bestseller for the publisher. There was no anti-Semitism anymore, only anti-Germanism. Now, this particular victim role of the Germans is, of course, an essential element of the right-wing historical myth. In 1914, already the empire was in a situation to adopt this particular myth. And as we have heard during the day in our deliberations among historians and experts, this has become a fundamental element of any right-wing movement ever since. Scholars like Gideon Butch refer to this approach as a historical fictional counter-narrative, which wants to turn the past into something it never was. The purpose of this operation is to establish a perceived identity between the individual and national history. This is the only possibility to become a sovereign country again. And this is, of course, the leading principle and the main idea of right-wing historical politics. It's always about a narrative. Germany should normalize itself by freeing itself from the alleged victor's narrative. And it's always a narrative. And this is what Kubitschek meant when he spoke of the poisoning of history. So Germany has to be normal again. And in order to enforce this historical fictional counter-narrative, it's necessary not only to ignore the findings of historical science from recent decades, but you have to overwrite them. And this is something we are seeing these days indeed. Now, this re-signification is actually happening, and this is why I would like to show you some pictures which show you that it has become an everyday staple these days. AfD, that's extraordinary. Remember the years before 1989, if you remember, and know which role the GDR played in the world vision of the extreme right wing. It was the enemy, the arch enemy, right? And today we find a strange way of referring back to the GDR, to East Germany, an appropriation or a reappropriation of the GDR past. I call it an anti-communist GDR nostalgia, which is being used and exploited politically by the AfD. And you see the contradictions in these arguments very well in these pictures. Now, this is a typical poster in the election campaign. You saw the Simpson, or you see the Simpson here, a motorbike. This was a brand made in the GDR, and there is a kind of subculture which still exists, and they still have these motorbikes. And you have here the motto Simpson instead of a carrier bike. So this refers back to the nostalgia, to East Germany and the GDR, and the green lifestyle, an ecological lifestyle where people use big bikes in order to schlep their things, is being hit. So a normal East German doesn't have these big bikes, but they have motorbikes made by Simpson or something similar. And then you have another poster, which you have seen for many years already, and this says "Vollende die Wende," accomplish the political transformation in Germany. And this is also a way to buy parts of the East German society. So you have those who feel nostalgia and they love the Simpson, and on the other hand, you have those who are still convinced of the need for a community. The GDR was such a close community. Nobody could get in, but nobody could get out either. And this is, so to speak, a statement meant to insinuate that the AfD is the party that has inherited or carries the heritage, the positive heritage of the citizens' movement in East Germany, so they can clearly grab the former East German society with this positive and or negative reference to the past. And this is what I found in a supermarket in Hamburg. There are different versions of this thing, BRD, or West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, without the Deutschmark. So this is what people love to leave in the shopping carts, and this is a kind of hidden form of advertising or propaganda of the AfD, because they produce these coins of Deutsche Mark and the AfD. Or if you look at the alt-right in the United States and follow their debates, and they are kind of extraordinary in terms of their praise of Eastern European countries or the former Soviet Union. This is very much directed against decadence. Actually, in this picture here, you could see on Twitter and X, this is Nina Vicentia, a former activist of the alt-right, married to Richard Spencer. And she's playing with these motifs. She's of Russian origin, but her family emigrated to Canada, which is where she grew up. And she says, well, communism wasn't good, it was bad. But the men, at least were men, they were like soldiers. And here, to your right, you see Polish men under American occupation, Polish men under Russian occupation, and you see the only Polish cosmonaut, a hero. I've read there was only one. I hope it's true. So, and compared to these heroes, you see Polish men and under American occupation. This does not really correspond to realities in the Eastern Bloc, and here you see a kind of androgen cosplayer or cross-dresser, right? So even if the former arch-enemy was the dominant force, there were things that were better than what we are having today. Or another example I would like to give, Erika Steinbach, a long chapter in my recent book, but this happened long before Elon Musk said that the Nazis were communists. So I'm referring to Erika Steinbach, who says the Nazis were a left-wing party. Have you forgotten? She asks, this is her argument. She says the National Socialist German Workers' Party was a left-wing thing. However, she doesn't say that the concept of socialism in the 1920s, in all political spectrum, was very present. So it was kind of empty, and it could be filled by all parties. So a workers' party was chosen by the right wing in order to have a difference between oneself and the more Marxist socialist parties of the workers. And this was the motivation for the name the NSDAP chose for itself. And this is simply ignored in a statement like the one we see here, the statement made by Erika Steinbach. I mean, of course, you can shift the Nazis to the left, which helps you get rid of all your problems. Or if you scratch on the blue surface, you see that there is a lot of brown color below, and there are symbolic allusions made to the past. Höcke had problems, even legal ones, because he used this phrase. And then there was a short dialogue with Elon Musk, who asked, why is it illegal, alles für Deutschland? So he rather thinks this is like MAGA. And Höcke says, well, because every patriot in Germany is considered a Nazi. You can read the English quote by Höcke on the slide. But the overall idea is to keep the Germans from finding themselves or finding oneself, which is another example of historical mythology. And it also shows you what Höcke understands by the Germans. And then there was the phonetic shift. Instead of alles für Deutschland, they said alles for Deutschland, alles for Germany, and really if people shout it, you cannot really distinguish whether they say alles or Alice or Alice. Or here, you see another interesting coding. You see the wing, which is being used as the symbol, as the logo of the AfD, and it's up to you to check which of the two eagles is the one that fits the AfD logo best. For me, this would have been the point or the moment in which a court should have, or politics should have, banned the party. We talked about lots of things today during our experts meeting and our conference. There are counter-narratives which are being used, or they just try to capture and reinterpret existing interpretations. That's actually what I wanted to tell you today. And when I prepared my presentation, I realized that I am in a bad mood if that's all I tell you. 2 days ago, someone sent me a video from Frankfurt. There are Gaza protesters. And I went to a Holocaust memorial, and they had scarves, and they declared themselves the children of the Holocaust survivors. I mean, you can think about the Gaza war and Israeli ultra-nationalism, what you want, but this is another form of historical revisionism, and there is the forced attack on the one hand, the right wing, which I've just talked about, but also on an international level in the context of the Gaza solidarity, and this is what makes me feel very, very concerned. Thank you very much.
Volker Weiß, haben Sie jetzt schon Ausführlichkeit
Volker Weiß, you have heard him in more detail, but now let me introduce the panel, although we've heard it from Mr. Albrecht already. Constanze Itzel, the director of the House of European History in Brussels. Welcome. Next to her, Frank Bösch. He is a historian and director of the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History Research in Potsdam. Welcome. Katja Mayer is a member of the Saxon State Parliament and former Saxon State Minister of Justice and for Democracy, Europe and Equality. A warm welcome to you.
Und ich möchte an dieser Stelle noch mal durchsagen.
And at this point, I would like to say that if you'd like to take my seat or walk in my shoes, well, you can also be outside. You can also follow this event outside this room. And actually, I would like to ask the panelists, after hearing a long input from Mr. Weiss, how about your everyday business, Constanze, for example, revisionism perceived from the Brussels perspective? To what extent does history influence the cooperation of right-wing extremist parties in Europe? And how far is your work context influenced by that? Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Good evening, everyone. Well, I really come from EU practice. I can talk about the past 8 years since the inauguration of the House of European History, we try to take a transnational European perspective beyond national, regional, and urban museums. It is about the 19th and 20th centuries, and you can certainly imagine that the concept making was difficult, and of course this triggered a big debate, and there were more than 300 reviews that were discussed, and I would like to talk about them. Out of them, there are many factual items of criticism that we can consider also in the conceiving of the permanent exhibition, but we try to really differentiate between scientific criticism and politically motivated criticism. Well, the latter, of course, is concerned. It came mainly from two countries, from Law and Justice in Poland, the predecessor government, and then from Hungary, and also from a Spanish platform that spread Polish comments. And, well, what we can say on the content, well, it's been mentioned already, transnational issues. The question, for example, what is missing, that historical narratives should be improved or corrected, Christian narratives. These are critical voices concerning the content, but let me focus on the methods for a moment, because the methods of these revisionist approaches, I would like to introduce them, because on the one hand, there is an attempt to use political power in order to attack historical narratives that have, of course, been drawn up by professional historians, and they want to amend them. So political players want to use this route, and then the freedom of science is thus undermined. Disinformation, we mentioned it already. So fake news about our narrative, and also letters without having seen the exhibition on the basis of topics that more concern the interior debate of a country, and then the suppression of any negative information about a country's own past. So parts of the exhibition have been criticized that counteract a certain narrative of being a victim or a hero, and then letters that take a very long time to answer, and questions about the background and legitimacy of historians and the political stance. Well, concerning the policy of these players, there has been a long-winded debate, and we are just one example here. We have a carrier organization, so we work within a very clearly demarcated context, but it's just a reflection of what is happening in the individual countries, Slovakia, or what's going on in the US. There are many examples, and these are just a few extracts or highlights from the many revisions we got. Thank you very much. These are the questions that we will hopefully discuss in the joint debate, what you can do to counteract them, the way you receive criticism, and how you have to put it into perspective. Well, and then Ms. Vorti, how has your work changed in the past election period? Although Volker Weiss already mentioned it, Maximilian Krah and the Simpson meeting, and that has taken place in many places. And then also what's been going on in Dresden. The interpreter apologizes. This is Katja Meyer speaking. And, well, this is certainly not just a typical Saxon problem. And, well, of course, this has alerted us. I was born in Zwickau. This is where NSU have been hiding for many years. I've been living in Dresden for many years. And, well, so this movement is very present to me, and thus the 13th February movement. And this is just one example that it is an attempt to really pursue and to reiterate the narrative of being a victim with the marches of mourning. And again, here an active civil society really has been successful in establishing a counter-narrative. And Mr. Weiss mentioned it in his presentation, dealing with the peaceful revolution, the so-called political transformation and their narratives. You can see very clearly politics about history doesn't have to be consistent. On the one hand, you can serve the pathos of the peaceful revolution, but on the other hand, calls for law and order. It does not seem very logical spontaneously, but what's decisive here is that it's not logic, but emotions, and voicing emotions is in the center. Thus, it is like them up there, the politicians, the dichotomy, and the us at the grassroots level. And thus, you need to devise perspectives and strategies, and this actually is happening at various levels. I mentioned Dresden, but there are many other examples. Of course, it is also a task of regional policy to take measures and to get active. We've done it at different places, but I'll come back to that. Thank you very much. And one question, because I was really looking for concrete examples. Does it really mean that with the revisionist narratives, does it mean that you are confronted with the revisionism in your day-to-day business? So would you say your day-to-day business has changed? You have to face up to this challenge? Yes, I would actually say so. In the past few years, it is a trend that has been developing. The 13th of February, well, if I may say so, we are in control, really, but this is really thanks to a very dedicated civil society. So the many marches from the right-wing extremists have been confronted with representatives from civil society, but it is also like the regional Office for Political Education has helped us, has opened and provided rooms, has invited to political debates, which was really good for the entire population. It is always a question of dealing with these narratives and dealing with the 13th of February. So there are the human chains on the 13th of February at 6 p.m., where you try to take to the streets and make people take to the streets, as many as possible. Others say, I don't want to participate in this because this puts things in too harmless a light, but we've been able to mobilize the masses, and I think both stances are justified. Well, Volker Weiss, what you can really deliver is a political perspective taking. So what would you say? I think I seem to be the timekeeper at the moment, so unfortunately we cannot hear a full input, but can you tell us where you see the most important bullet points when looking back? So there is, of course, a history to creating narratives and speaking in extracts. Well, as a historian, I really have to say self-critically that hardly any research has been done on right-wing extremism until 2010 or so. So we have in Potsdam really created a center for that with a lot of fundamental research, but things that feed back into society. So a new portal is to be opened on documentation of the radical right. For example, the Auschwitz lie of 1973, and it is put into perspective also in educational activities. Then we have working or task forces on the political extreme right. And if you're interested, Zeitgeschichte Arbeit, you can Google it. So everybody who is interested in history, do Google us. And there is one key question: what status does history have for the extreme right? So we can say, yes, there is a very central dimension for the obsession of the extreme right, as we put it. And this is a very present phenomenon in Germany, and I could answer at great length. But when looking at the NPD, the party that was in 7 regional parliaments since the 60s, they've been successful, and in their political program they had very vague points in 1965 to position themselves as being right of the CDU. And then history really had a very important role to play. Why was that so? A short answer, Mr. Weiss said it: national heroism and national identification, and then reversing the perpetrator-victim roles, and also a material dimension as well. The idea that Germany has to pay for every country in the world and nothing is left for the Germans themselves. And this was a very central narrative in the 60s. And, you know, money that is being spent on memorials, and also a legal dimension. In the 60s, it was really present at the Auschwitz legal proceedings. But even today, if you deny the Holocaust or that the Shoah hadn't existed, and the political dimension, and the idea that we're not sovereign because we are chained to the Holocaust, this is something that came up in the 60s, and it is still virulent. Germany was not free. Mr. Kubitschek, he called it the connection or the wiring. And then in 1968, the last thing, the cultural dimension, history as something that is a counter picture to the loose moral values of the students' movements in 1968 and onwards. So this is a positioning where we see many similarities, even in the societal conditions themselves have changed. Okay, and we also heard about being torn in history, and why is this so much put in the focus instead of the present that would offer ample room for discussion? Well, the extreme right in many countries believes that there is a decline, that there was some heroically narrated good times, the heyday. There was a previous time, and maybe it is associated with the German emperor in Germany, but it is like reverting in some previous history. So there is a blank that is being filled. It does not have to be concrete, but values like grandeur, honor, and strength, power, and of course racial purity, and or völkische purity, as they like to call it. And it has such a big role to play, and especially in Germany, there is the difficult challenge that on the one hand there is a fascination with National Socialism, with the Second World War, and at the same time, you have to test the limits all the time, in how far you can play with this fascination, and how far the individual performance or acquisition of individual soldiers or the Waffen-SS. And this is very central, and this is also being used for other countries, India and Latin America. Well, when we heard Mr. Kubitschek's remarks, Mr. Weiss, maybe you can summarize it, if possible at all, this reinterpretation used in historical revisionism. Kubitschek speaks about different perspectives and levels and historical narratives, and he talks about something that may sound strange, but language really has a role to play. So it is not the big notions, but the level appears more open, and it appears as if somebody was taking a different perspective. Well, yes, this creates an effect. It is not an agitational speech, as one could think. So it still sounds bourgeois, and at the linguistic level is very interesting to me, because on the one hand, he has a tendency to speak in military terms, and then the Ernst Jünger mimicry. And, you know, he talks about wiring things, connecting them, but he brings it to the point. And like, we are the battalion, and the fighters in the vanguard that conquer something. And it is not always a matter of perspective, so that's commonplace. Of course, everything is always a question of perspective, but there's also real history behind it, and he really turns it in a way in his contribution as if everything was intensive. I mean, he, during his studies, really focused on historical discourse. This appeared progressive. No reality exists, but everything dissolves into linguistic levels. But, well, society is not a text. That would be the right answer, and he can play with that. And the same in this context. He deplores a lot of guerrilla theory, and he also has leftist strategies, and that he has been able to take over, and it is the turn that matters. Okay, Constanze Itze, this is probably the problem about dealing with criticism. What is highly discursive, what are facts, and what is the truth, and how far can you find a discourse? I mean, these are often stalemate discussions, aren't they? Like dead-end roads. And the ways of taking a stance. Well, first of all, we differentiate between disinformation and actual criticism, and we take it very seriously. So we do react to criticism in the form of exhibitions. And I think in the exhibitions we have to continue along these lines. You said a different position. It is really comparing different positions to juxtapose them or to put them next to each other, not like identity-creating narratives. This was done during the 19th century. This was meant for a certain territory or a certain nation, but really focusing on differences and explicitly pointing to differences, and to then can create a better understanding, a better mutual understanding, because you cannot assume that everybody in Europe has the same concept of their own past. So we really have to focus on these differences and sharpen the view for them. So this could increase a better mutual understanding for the present. We are working on different formats. They exist already in debate or event form, and this multi-perspective approach is really important. We all come from a national tradition, and this is really a cure against the idea of we as a group, a nation, a linguistic community, as if we knew something better than others do. So it makes you more humble if you deal with differences, and these formats help to counteract a simplification. And then the Zeitzeugen and the witnesses of their time, is that important? Yes, of course it is important. This is a medium that has been used for ages. But something that I've seen in a different museum is to juxtapose contradictory positions and to sustain them. So you can't always expect a consensus. You have to agree to differ at times in order to devise a common understanding, so that you know the others, not just yourself. You're looking at me as if you wanted to add on that.
Ask your grandfather is what Maximilian Krah said. I mean, the witnesses of the time are in the family, meaning that in the family you have the knowledge as compared to the experts' knowledge. I mean, we don't have to underline that Krah's grandfather was a member of the Nazi Party, NSDAP, but what I'm meaning to say is that you have this particular historical logic be part of the right-wing logic, and you have an idea in the people, so to speak, which is different from what the experts think. So the witness of the time is not only referring to Jewish survivors, witnesses going to schools, but also something which are being used in order to establish counter-narratives, irrespective of the scientific background. After Holocaust, the series was screened on TV. There were also situations of having the perpetrator and the victims talk. You had people in prison who told their stories, but there was also the other side telling stories, and the makers relied on the audience knowing what to think. But there is always a certain level of research concerning the Holocaust and others, of course. So I would like to say we should warn against those alleged witnesses of the time. Now, witnesses of the time also let me think of the positive task they fulfill. But maybe we are living in a pluralistic society, maybe not in Saxony, but otherwise, where we also have to talk about what museums do in order to present history. They also have to do justice to the immigration society, and this is also about a shared awareness of the German or European history. Maybe we have to find new and other answers. Well, actually, I wanted to ask Constanze, but Mr. Weiss wants to take the floor. Yeah, but we are kind of moving into a very positivistic attitude in terms of museal education or museums education. And I mean, look at how the right wing deals with mythology. They need the myths. They want the myths. Facts don't really help you because they say we want a national myth, whatever you say. Yeah, but then the question is, how can we move forward then? What can we do in terms of a follow-up? Because of course, it's right, we cannot talk about museums and education and information only. But the question is, who can stop the myth? Or who can counter the myth? If it's not an exhibition or talking to witnesses of the time. Yeah, of course, I don't want to argue against enlightenment or education. I just want to say that we have to deconstruct myths. But how do we do this? Facts, history, what else? I'm a historian, so I'd like to suggest the analysis which is based on sources. That should be our point of departure, I'd say. But then films like Schindler's List or others, which are not just a crude mix of facts, but which also show pictures that overwhelm, could be considered. The same goes for social media. There are different narrative formats which can be used. Different narratives, individual or individualized narratives. So we have to try and find other formats. Now there are different directions I could now head to, but maybe let's just briefly ponder the idea of responsibility again, because it took a long time until historians started carrying out research concerning right-wing movements of the time. But then, of course, scientists always have to figure out whether they are getting too activistic, maybe, or too political. But we won't gain a thing unless we do something about the permanent divides which are popping up. I mean, Volker Weiss is also a historian, so the question is, what do we do in a situation in which we have to explain our perspective or our attitude before we can start talking about the facts and the process? How do you uncover myths? And how can you tell history? Well, maybe you've seen in FAZ the article about activism or left-wing movements in sciences, especially in history. There was also a statement made by the former chairman of the Historians Association, arguing against the activism of the AfD without naming it. Now, lots of historians got angry because of statements like the ones we've heard here. So this is clearly splitting the discipline, dividing. And this is clearly reflected in the debates led by historians. There are also historians for democracy, that's a network, and they are also planning activist interventions, like in preparation of 3rd of October, for example. But I think my role is also in the field of fundamental research, where I am maybe a bit more sober, but this is where my competence is, where my qualification is.
mitunter antworte ich und wenn man
Sometimes I answer if I hear those arguments of the right wing, and if it's possible to show facts and do something about arguments, the tone, and sometimes also the arguments change. You don't always know where people come from, but sometimes you do have AfD people involved in those debates, and then it's quite good to not get angry and shout, but be a bit more laid back and calm. I mean, we have talked a lot about it because of schools and memorials and memorial sites, and yet young people vote for the AfD a lot. Yeah, I mean, this is certainly about the political responsibility, but in addition, Constanze or Katja?
Ergänzen oder vielleicht auch fragen wollte, weil Sie jetzt auch gerade explizit den Historikertag angesprochen haben.
No, you just mentioned the Historians' Day, and I do remember the Historians' Day in Leipzig in 2023, where the Premier of Saxony gave a speech which found an echo in the media because of a sentence he said about the Stalin Note 1952, and he said there was something else, right? I guess most of you know what the Stalin Note is about. In 1952, Stalin said that Germany could be reunited once it would be neutral. However, historians have proven that he never said so. And yet the story pops up time and again, and politics also plays, and the right wing especially plays with this narrative in order to reach out to the citizens in Saxony and in other East German states. So we are talking about right-wing forces, and we're talking about the AfD. And it's important. But I think we also have to look at the center, the political center, because they are responsible too in view of narratives which are being offered without being true.
Volker Weiß, dazu das auch gleich an Sie, weil Sie könnten nämlich dann auch noch gleich noch die Medien, glaube ich,
Maybe Volker Weiß, you could also comment on the media. Since we are talking about responsibility, the responsibility of scholars, scientists, politicians, what about the media? I mean, of course, we do have the social media and the internet, but the media at large, I'm meaning.
Nicht dieser jetzt speziell, aber man hat das Gefühl, man dreht sich im Kreis.
Because often I get the feeling that in debates like the one we are having here, we are moving in circles. And while we are talking, the next lie is being spread in the world or to the world. So what can we do? Or can you at least help me analyze the situation and answer the question, who is to be blamed? Well, I think there are lots of external factors we have to consider. I mean, it's quite nice, the Stalin Note debate. I saw the broadcasting from the Historians' Day, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Embarrassing. I mean, actually, I knew this story from the DKP, from the Communist Party in West Germany, and now it's being taken up by the CDU, by the conservatives. So that's kind of bizarre. But then we also have to see the Ukraine war and the neutrality debate. And without the two, people wouldn't have mentioned the Stalin Note, I guess. So we need to bear in mind that there are external factors that matter. And if you rely on education and information, you need to nevertheless admit that no matter how hard you try, you cannot reach, and you do not reach everybody. And I mean, look at the United States, and there are also lots of stories generated there, and they come over, they are being brought here. And the anti-American mood that existed in the past has changed completely. They have Americanized, I'd say, and we can only try and offer arguments against these stories. I'd like to also ask, why do people want stability? Why do they want identity? I wonder. Where are the material foundations, the basis of what is happening in the United States and here? What about the capital concentration, which pushed the tech bubble into a situation in which it produced an Elon Musk? All these aspects need to be seen. And we have to consider them and we have to work on them. Now let me get back to you, Constanze Itzel, please, because we had the idea of showing history and facts in museums. That's what you said. But then there was also another aspect I felt in your presentation, i.e., is there an opportunity to talk about other societal facts? What about empathy? I mean, of course, you can take all these facts from the world together and insist on talking about the facts, but what about the somewhat courageous question of, have we focused too much on history? What about the human factor? What about being much more focused on feelings? I mean, probably you don't like it, because who wants to talk about feelings, about emotion? But then historical myths are about emotions. So is this also a fact that's interesting in the context of mapping history or historiography? Well, based on the experience of my team, I'd say we have too much own history. Everybody tells their own history. That's the experience I've had. I mean, it's quite difficult to get out of your own perspective in a multinational team. I talked about the Berlin Wall, but then someone said I should talk about the Iron Curtain. I shouldn't have the German perspective only. I mean, it's an anecdote, right? It's just a detail, but it shows what it's all about. And of course, the more we know and the more we understand each other, the easier it gets to explain the differences of the present. There are two museums, one in France, one in Gdansk. They're dealing with the history of the war, and they present the war not in the perspective of the heroes or the victims only. And this is a very special and particular approach. And then we have diversity in society, as you said, and organizations like this one, which are meant to be much more representative. And of course, you have to talk about all these narratives. So you have to talk about narratives which also reflect the diversity in society. I don't know what the situation is in academia, in the sciences, but I'm often invited, and the discourses are often very national, which is normal, actually. But in addition, we would benefit if we looked beyond our purely national perspective. But I'd like to also say, if you look at other countries, you see where we are headed, maybe. Because this is about the freedom of sciences, and this is something we might lose. And here the question is, what about prevention? What can we do in order to prevent that from happening? I mean, just read the letter written to the Smithsonian, and you get an idea of the political intervention which is possible in view of individual texts, for example. And the question is, what can a democratic society do in order to keep this from happening? Are there certain legal conditions we can improve? What can be done, and what about the commitment of the democratic political parties when it comes to the defense of the freedom of sciences? Two aspects. We had a research project, and we talked about exhibitions dealing with East Germany. We asked people, what do you see? And people tend to see their own history, no matter what is written or told by an exhibition or in an exhibition. They always see their own history and their position. And this is irrespective of the fact whether they see the past positive or negative in the GDR. What can we do? Now, we have opted for so-called moving labs. That is to say, we go to places with a particular relationship or connection with the research projects, and we spend an afternoon with the people there, with the locals, and they can tell us their stories. We were in Küstrin, we were on the Oder River, where they wanted to use old barracks for a refugee center or camp, a detention center, sorry, deportation center. And in our conversation, there were lots of people who said, yeah, it wasn't that bad. In the past, it was quite good when the soldiers were still here. And this is good, this is interesting. I mean, this is an input we collect and analyze, and at the same time, we try to bring our research forward. And we are having this lab in Neustrelitz in 2 weeks. There are several thousands of people who used to work for the Deutsche Bahn, and they were really embittered in the 1990s because they all lost their job. So we'll see what they say. And now, the level of facts. I mean, sounds easy if you have the huge facts like the Stalinot, and people can argue easily against this nonsense. But it's much more difficult at the memorial sites, for example, because people are reading a lot, and then Gauland is standing in front of you, and he has read quite a number of books, and he is quoting from very specific books. And at the same time, they offer a very specific, detailed knowledge concerning a specific space, and they are confronting people there with facts which are taken out of the context. So you have to be capable of arguing against those arguments, meaning we need a special training for the people who work there or who are there, so that they can face those confrontations, so that they know how to deal with this particular right-wing strategy. I mean, the strategy has been since the 1950s to adopt serious, sincere scholars and quote from the context, out of the context. This happened already in the past, so we have to train them. Maybe, Katja Meyer, there is another topic we have on our agenda. The NSU Documentation Center is another site I would like to mention. This is about the crimes of the NSU. The flower trader Shimshek was killed, and we are approaching the anniversary of this date, and this venue has been opened, and you fought for it. So please tell us briefly what can be done. I think there was also there were a number of debates. Not everybody wanted to have this documentation center there. So what does this documentation center, the NSU Documentation Center, for you? Because this is also about telling history.
Well, I think I have to go back a little bit in time. I was born in Zwickau, so in the city where the three NSU people were hiding. And actually, I had already been back to the city when Beate Zschäpe really blew up that building, and the dealings with it and the dealings of the police and the legal system with these events, and also the actually self-infliction of the group of three. But it was more than that. It was an entire network. It was not just in Zwickau, but also in Chemnitz, where an active civil society organized itself. And they said, we don't want to finish off dealing with history, but we really want to see it reflected in our local history. We want to discuss it, we want to reflect it, and we also want to place for memorizing the victims. And in Zwickau, there have been many debates also in the city council, not just in Zwickau, but also in Zwickau, where there is a documentation center now, where the city council is now saying, including the Lord Mayor, well, we only want to be connected just with that. And they always associate us with NSU. There is so much more about Chemnitz and Zwickau. And, you know, they fear that the terrible murders and NSU would be associated with these two cities. Nonetheless, civil society has continued to be active. In Zwickau, every victim got a memorial tree that was planted for them. This is part of it, you know, and there were name signs, and of course their names were misspelled. It's always like that, isn't it? So then you really wonder how serious they actually were. Then the trees were felled, and there was an active group of students that set up a bench, a memorial bench. This again was demolished, and now there is a lighting, and thus the entire place is better protected. This always gives rise to the question of how we can create a place of dealing with this. And Chemnitz is also a cultural capital, and they also organize critical city walks where the group of three was hiding in Zwickau at first. This is where they have the city walks. Claudia Roth, as the then culture minister, and I as a minister for democracy, we advocated funds, but not everybody agreed that there should be a place of memorial and of exchange. But there was a high level of resistance, on the one hand from the part of the city inhabitants, but we also have to say it very clearly, CDU, for the reasons stated, also opposed this idea. Nonetheless, we were successful in securing the financing during the time of being a cultural capital, but we also need a future funding, and well, we also have virtual places, and there was a level of dissonance. The documentation center is really, really good. It is not only that it welcomes many classes of students, but it's also a place of learning, cooperation with the police. There are students from the police academy, and it is not the perpetrators that are put in the focus, but the victims. And this links up to what you just said. It links up to the personal stories. There are personal objects to be found from the victims. There are photos, there are videos, and of course the dealing with the examinations committee on NSU, and thus it should not end in memorizing, but it's also a forward-looking place, a place of learning. Well, as you put it, otherwise you end up in the role of being a mediator and a teacher. And, well, what else can you find to it? What is a resignification? How do you recognize such attempts? And then also the ascribing telling of stories to certain places. Do you think it's a good approach, or do you think anything is missing here? The project as such, I would certainly endorse it. I'm just wondering what burden history has to take, because they don't have the financial means. Well, in Hamburg, there's less and less history being taught at public schools. I don't know about Berlin, but as I said earlier, I just wanted to make clear that in the didactic educational planning, you always need to keep in mind that you always have technical barriers. And then the question always is what societal framework there is that these memorial sites are being put to or a victim of vandalism. So we don't need to feel just obliged, and it mustn't stop there. And historians can't do all the work. Well, maybe you can. No, of course not. But as I said, we have such a lot of history, we have such a lot of education, and I can't quantify it, but there is a high level of support. But I went to school in the 80s, and in Schleswig-Holstein, the northernmost federal state, we didn't even learn about National Socialism during the 80s. And a provocative question, do we need less history? Well, there is a high level of demand for learning about history. And if you look at the bestseller list, history is really somewhere in high demand, whether it is more distant history or not. Adenauer and de Gaulle at prime time on public TV and podcasts about history, they're quite successful. So there is a high level of demand for history, including the far right. Well, being here at the Böll Foundation, the Greens are very future-oriented. Of course, they do have a very important role when it comes to dealing with National Socialism. So that, nonetheless, they don't capitalize so much on history as the conservatives. Maybe that's missing. If you can't offer a perspective on history, whether as a role model or as a deterrent, but I think history always is a resource. At the end, you don't have a choice, like we'll do less of history, even if politics want to save on that when it comes to school funding. I don't want to give the impression that the facilitator is not interested. Mr. Weiss, well, is that touching on history, or is it a nostalgic yearning when it comes to algorithms like so let's hope that, when it comes to my Google history, I do hope that they don't think I'm a right-wing extremist due to my search history. But there seems to be an algorithm like reenacting, where they reenact historical battles, and they focus on the individual screws and instruments, and there are no right-wing extremists. They assert they're extremely interested in history, but it's a terrible reactionary nostalgia, and then it is always the noble Wehrmacht soldier, and then he sees a GI, and they too shake hands, and all the others are dead. I don't know if you already noticed that, but there is such a lot of these examples. That longing to deal with history, well, I don't know about these films, but there are certain repertoires where all needs are satisfied, and there seems to be a need. How about the others? What is behind such endeavors? Yes, we have to say that it is young men who are interested, these right-wing narratives, and it is something heroic to be successful, whether you're a ninja or a Wehrmacht soldier. This is not history in the proper sense of the word. It is some romanticized idealization offer, so to walk in the shoes of some hero, but it creates an effect, and we need to deal with it. And I feel the same. I mean, maybe I do not search such a lot about right-wing things, but FAZ and Die Welt and these newspapers, they all deal with history, and we are grateful that they do. And such national newspapers, such opinion leader newspapers deal with it. Colonialism and the restitution of colonial goods, that's a good thing. And dealing with it also in order to create or at least negotiate some national identification. Also, with a view to the time, I would now like to open the panel. Okay, there's a question from the audience, so I don't need to ask my remaining questions. Let's start over here. I think we've got microphones, and my colleagues will bring them to your seat. So this gentleman in the first row, maybe we can have him first. And we'll have more questions, of course. I'm a spokesperson of the Alliance for the Value of the Past, and I saw a contradiction between the closeness of political activism and the openness of research. I just want to advocate openness. We are not activists with a closed attitude approaching society. This would be for others. Even when it comes to Stalin, Mr. Weiss, there were different offerings, and the question of neutrality and free elections, and then there is an open discussion, and we simply believe that you need an open discourse, and research lives on contradictions, and we have to deal with it, of course, but we are observers, and well, the existing history and image of history is not what the extreme right is asking for. They capitalize on storytelling, not on the truth. And then, okay, we can give these questions back to society. Of course, we are part of it. So if they ask us, we will provide an answer, but we are not the truth as such. Maybe you don't want to answer the question because nothing has to be expected from that. No, I was just joking. So who plays what role in that discourse? If you'd like to answer to that, you're welcome to do so. Yes, I would like to answer questions collectively, but nonetheless, this is what I was talking about, activism, and there are reasons and situations where you can be activist and be transparent, but this openness has a pathos of being, well, unemotional, and I think you can get far with that. We've got some more questions over here.
Ja, vielen Dank. Jasch ist mein Name.
Thank you. My name is Jasch, and I am also in front of being non-emotional. But the question we have to ask really is a question directed towards the political community, with a view to this threatening situation that our democratic system is faced with. And when looking at the surveys in Saxonia, Western Saxonia, the idea of addressing the SPD, for example. Shouldn't the history of democracy be used without creating even new myths? But couldn't it serve as a new story? And what could be the contribution of the political community? A promotion campaign for democracy? Well, maybe I can ask the former Minister for Democracy. Well, I think you really need spaces for exchange, and I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, but nonetheless it can be via history, but things that move people on the spot, and in rural areas, whether it be in Western or Eastern Germany, the latter maybe even more strongly. After 1990, there were no physical spaces anymore, and I think they have not come back. Spaces where people have room for discussion, for exchange, maybe also in a moderated format. This is something we have been dealing with in the last government, but we created spaces for social life and spaces for democracy. And I'm a bit self-critical here with a view to the notion, but the notion of a political has already become an aggressive slogan, really. I think this development is quite dangerous. It is only last week I was sitting on the legal committee, and the CDU then said, well, it is becoming too political here. We are talking about the regional parliament, and this is a development that is hidden behind so-called neutrality.
Aber natürlich müssen wir dem als demokratische Kräfte
as forces of democracy need to find answers. We need to create spaces where a discourse can take place.
Storytelling, of course, sozusagen als Antwort auf das, was von rechter Seite passiert, ja die ganze Zeit. Aber die Frage ist immer, es sollte sozusagen nicht im Storytelling und im Geschichtenerzählen.
But it shouldn't stop at the storytelling. You need some content as well. Mentioning Saxony-Anhalt, okay, but when talking about democracy, we
hier auf dieser Seite hat jemand.
There was somebody or a question over here.
Eigentlich müsste es einfach so gehen. Ah, nee, geht's nicht. Vielleicht, aber wenn Sie ganz laut reden, hilft es nichts, weil
yes, now
jetzt geht's. Okay, super.
The interpreter is speaking, they always have to use a microphone, otherwise we couldn't translate.
Talk some emotions, share some emotions, and ask some humble questions. They're both as an insider and as an outsider. And as an outsider, it comes easy. My first emotion is the question I ask myself during the entire debate is how much rules of politeness can you break to bring up a taboo topic as an outsider? Now, I've been both optimistic and very pessimistic. Optimistic because I share a lot of opinions with all of you, and I think we're optimistic if we can see that actually we just believe, and I think rightly believe, that our most classical epistemic virtues have to be exercised, extended to create a healthy democratic culture. I mean, being able to speak about any topic, bringing up arguments, not tabooing, not using euphemisms, not playing on the person, but on the argument, not bringing up your emotion instead of arguments. Of course, you can share your emotion. I am offended, I'm worried. I'm not offended, I'm worried. Now, let me bring up a topic that has been present and absent in the meantime. I think you all understand what topic I want to bring up, and what I consider the genocide in Palestine. It's been very present during the day, the conference, but it's been present in a way that I believe is very scary. I am very worried, and I think it's more respectful to speak your mind than shut up and not. And I need to believe, I need you to believe that I mean constructively. How has it been mentioned today? One time, it's been called the consequence of 7th of October attacks. Another time, there's been a reference to Dirk Moses, which, as an outsider, I feel was dismissive, but I don't know because no arguments were given. And in this talk, it is being raised in a very, I believe, extremely ironical way at the end of a talk, showing an emotion of being worried or offended, which I, of course, respect very much, but with no elaboration of arguments. What happens at that moment is that the robustness, that I become very skeptical about the robustness of an academic community if these things are not to be discussed. So I want to raise two humble questions. What is it to take anti-Semitism seriously, which has rightly been put on the table during the conference several times today? I think we need to keep on taking anti-Semitism seriously. The humble question that I have is whether as an academic community, not individual members, nobody has to be forced to think anything, but as a community, in the longer run, do we fight anti-Semitism by every time somebody criticizes Israel saying it's an anti-Semite, or shouting out about the genocide? Okay? So if you use your last words of something, speak out against the genocide if you want to be anti-Semitic. Oh, I mean, that's a question. Could that be? The second question I have, who is it to decide on who are the children of the Holocaust and who are not? I think it's rather ironic that a condemnation, which can be very distasteful, can be insensitive, which I agree with. Don't do that at the Holocaust Memorial. I dislike that. But who are we as historians to say who can compare what to what and be dismissive of that comparison and then compare the right-wing and left-wing revisionism? These are not to be compared, in my opinion. If somebody asks to kill Muslims, right, and is hateful, and another one tries to stop a genocide, and you think that's a comparable revisionism? Honestly, I don't believe so. So my question is, who is it to decide who are the children of the Holocaust? Is it the Germans because of a national? Is it a biological bloodline? Who are the children of the Holocaust? No, I don't. I think if we respect ourselves, we give an answer to that question. We don't condemn it. We humbly ask ourselves, who are indeed not the children of the Holocaust? Who are not the children of the Holocaust? Sorry to be so impolite, but it's honest.
Nein, ist okay. Das ist total okay. Ich habe das, dass ich es an dieser Stelle anfange zu unterbrechen, liegt tatsächlich einfach daran.
Sorry, I had to interrupt you because you are opening another huge topic. I think we decided for the debate about the right-wing historical mythology. So we did not embark on the topic you are mentioning, not because it's not worth it, but we are reaching the end of our event, and the panel was meant to focus on another aspect, because I cannot tell you more. I cannot say anything about the conference as such or in general. Maybe someone else can. But I can only talk about this particular panel discussion, and we cannot include more perspectives here. I think you need to understand this. We had a clear topic for the night. Yeah, right, but I made a remark and he addressed me, so I would like to answer. I can't solve the Middle East conflict. But I don't accept the rhetoric of this being a taboo. If I open a newspaper in Germany, no matter which, I find the topic permanently. They talk about it all the time. 7th October, but also everything else. So I think there is a very one-sided Palestine solidarity movement, and they don't speak about 7th October. I see it here, I see it in Hamburg.
Okay, das ehrt Sie, aber ich würde gerne meinen Punkt weitermachen. Ja, es gehört da eben dazu, dann erstmal das große Tabu aufzumachen.
So this is about the big taboo, allegedly, which actually is not a taboo. There's a lot of polarization in the debate. The question of the Holocaust, what is the doctrine, the debate has been around for decades. I've received a paper document with the title Education After Gaza, which is an attempt, a failed one, however, a scandalous one, to use Adorno's Education After Auschwitz with respect to Gaza. There is a lot of contextualization and a not really precise use of the terminology. And I'm not talking about the Gaza war, because this would be history, but I am talking about the context of the war and the achievements in this society which have not been achieved in harmony. So there were major debates. The tiny little bit of progress I see attacked by a movement which is a bit suspect, if you ask me.
Sie haben Ihre Punkte gemacht.
Whose sympathies are a bit suspect to me.
Es ist immer schwierig, an der Stelle Dinge abzubrechen.
Well, it's always difficult to stop a debate which is present, but there's also an opportunity to talk directly with each other after this panel discussion. But there were more requests for the floor.
Jetzt habe ich dort vor lauter Schreck, weiß ich doch gar nicht mehr. Sie oder der schnipst, darf der zuerst? Wer am lautesten schnipst,
so,
als Regel?
Who should speak first?
Jetzt wird das erstmal ausdiskutiert. Wer hat denn jetzt geschnipst? Dann machen Sie doch einfach mal.
Why don't you just take the floor? Someone made a sound with his fingers or their fingers. Who was it?
Ich habe zwar nicht geschnipst,
Ach so, okay.
I wurde geschnipst. Genau.
Did not make any sound with my fingers, but
Anderes Thema. Ich würde gerne eine Frage an.
I would like to ask a question to Mrs. Itzel.
Also einfach auch nochmal Beobachtung dieser Diskussion. Sie haben jetzt eigentlich, habe ich verstanden, nochmal eine Lanze für noch mehr Multiperspektivität.
You said we need more multiperspectivity and contradictions. Also in education, in your museum, in other museums.
Hat ja eigentlich fast so ein bisschen das Gegenteil
and
aufgedeckt, nämlich also
Mr. Weiss said just the opposite. Kubitschek is a person who represents a certain perspective. And he tries to convince others, so he goes and says, this is our perspective, there are other perspectives, and this is a propaganda battle that we are waging. I'm not sure whether more multi-perspectivity is a solution. And I mean, can we then still justify that Mr. Kubitschek's perspective is not part of our exhibition?
Ja, also wir können sammeln. Ich fand das jetzt nur gerade so, wollen Sie das gerne vorschlagen, Herr Bösch, dann sammle ich. Ich mache hier alles mit. Jetzt, wer schnipst, ist dran. Das haben wir jetzt schon mal und es wird gesammelt. Aber merken Sie sich,
so maybe we collect a few questions, 2 or 3 more, and then we have reached the end of our discussion here.
Bis vor kurzem das Museum Utopie und Alltag geleitet.
I used to be the director of the museum Culture and Everyday Life, and now I'm working on transformation
Nicht nur mit dem Blick zurück, sondern auch nach vorne. Und
for the transformation project.
Des Mythos, weil ich finde das sehr.
History is not only about looking back, but also about looking forward. And in addition to the facts, we also need to see the needs of a society. Maybe the sister of mythology is the utopia.
zur Vergangenheit mit diesen faktenbasierten Gesprächen nicht immer auch
and maybe when we just talk about the facts and the past,
darüber, wie wir erfolgreich sein
we
können.
should also talk about the question how to be successful. Because you talked the successless person, the failed person. Mr. Weiss also mentioned a number of problems. So how can we be successful without destroying ourselves? There is a fundamental mood, and everybody can ask themselves whether they feel concerned or affected. But that's an important direction. Duly noted. And now the next question. I studied history, but that was a long time ago.
Das ist zwischendurch bei Herrn Weiss auch mal so angeklungen. Ich wollte Sie jetzt so ein bisschen aus Ihrer Pflicht nehmen. Ich habe so den.
And actually, I would like to take you out of your obligation because you can present beautiful historical presentations, but people are trying to find a vision, something positive. And this is not racism or armament or cutting the Bürgergeld.
Ich finde Herr Kubitschek und die AfD in die falsche Richtung.
People are trying to find something positive. I mean, it's not the right direction in which the AfD and Mr. Kubitschek goes. So historians do a good job, but politics doesn't work. And I'm now appealing to a member of a political party which is represented in the regional parliament of Saxony. Sorry for that, but the trend seems to be very different these days. People are very negative. They complain about public transport, and you don't get any emergency rescue if you go to the Charité hospital anymore. And then there are the ones who come and say, let's change Germany, it needs to be great again. This is maybe a bit of polemics, but still I wanted to make this statement.
Eine Anmerkung noch in kurz und dann haken wir das hier mal ab und gehen dann weiter in alle Themenbereiche dieser Welt. Bitte schön. Jetzt habe ich hier nicht mehr hingeguckt. Sind Sie alle traurig? Nee, da ist nichts. Das ist gut. Stimmt.
Bin ich dran?
Okay, zwei noch. Ja. Bitte.
Ja, ich wollte auf das Thema Mythen zu sprechen kommen und ich finde das super wichtig.
Myth. That's what I would like to talk about, the deconstruction of myths. That's what I love. However, what about the self-critical glance of history at its own myths? We are in Prussia in a Hegelian sense. We believe in progress and we think we are the leaders of history. Das Bretmanns Stalin-Note anecdote is a means to an end, maybe. It's a tool or a toy. Because he's playing with it, because this miracle narrative concerning the German unification hasn't reached people in Eastern Europe because it doesn't correspond to their life or lived reality. We also have a problem with ambiguity tolerances. Katja Heuer's book, for example, who criticizes Stalin and the Stasi a lot. But she was criticized harshly in Germany, and I asked myself, what about ambiguity tolerance and the openness for discourses? So the societal center, which would actually be at our side when fighting the right wing, moves to the right from the SED and the DKP and other similar movements because they're not convinced of the history, and we are losing people when trying to fight right-wing narratives.
Die Referenzen zum Holocaust zurückzukommen.
And I would like to come back to the Holocaust reference in the old Federal Republic. Politicians did not really talk about it, and the Weizsäcker speech was kind of unique and did not really have an impact in society. There were even members of the CDU who wanted to get parts of Eastern Europe back into Germany. I mean, people went and compared Srebrenica and Auschwitz in order to criticize human rights violations, and Putin was compared to Hitler and Hussein too. But now we have those taboos. Mascha Gessen would be an example concerning the HBS. Can you compare the Warsaw Ghetto and Gaza? And she says, this is about, or they say, this is about finding similarities and differences, but we are losing people who supported a very robust historiography, but today they rather give up.
Damit fangen wir an. Ich fand alles interessant, aber das finde ich tatsächlich.
That's very interesting. And you covered lots of topics too. And we cannot talk about all these topics here on the panel. But self-reflecting historical studies.
Erinnern. Es sind noch 3 weitere Fragen und Sie hatten eigentlich auch noch eine. Jetzt fangen wir mal so schnell an. Also hinterfragt sich die Geschichtswissenschaft mit ihren Positionen genug, um...
So the question is, first and foremost, do historians ask enough questions in order to have people not lose confidence in them? Right, self-criticism, self-critique. I mean, that's what I said, right? Historians have not really dealt with what happened in the 1950s also in terms of violence, and there is a major self-reflection also with respect to challenges and their impact on the trends of the time, climate change and others which haven't been part of previous debate. And yet I don't agree to what you say because I don't agree to your conclusions. I don't want to talk about Katja Heuer and the beautification of the GDR. There are certainly debates we have to have.
Transformationszeit sehr positiv gesehen wurde in diesen sehr erfolgreichen Büchern von Sascha Kowalczuk und anderen.
Now, Sascha Kowalczuk and others had a very positive stance in view of the transformation period.
Vielleicht eben auch über die Zeit seit 1990 eben auch zu urteilen wäre.
And maybe it would be important to also consider the colonization of the East, what Oschmann and others said, i.e. the discourse that popped up after 1990. So there are different voices, but this also gets me to the other part of your question. Do we need positive stories? We talked about memorial sites, we talked about former concentration camps, and now and Stasi places and others. And we tried to also deal with the 76-year history of the Federal Republic of Germany, and we tried to open the space for lots of histories, which is important also in terms of political education. However, in research and in our scientific work, the history of the Federal Republic of Germany has become darker in recent times. I mean, this is not only about political education and Adenauer as a model. This is also about historically assessing the situation. Now concerning the facts, do we have too many facts? Interestingly, The majority of the population is interested in facts. They want to have stories and history which is correct, but that's not the science of history, because the science of history is not based on interpretation. It's much more complex. We have to go beyond the facts. And we have to have a number at the end of the day, something clear. And we have to show in a transparent way how you get from numbers to assessments and judgments.
Politik liegt im Argen. Die Leute brauchen was Positives, Visionen. Er lacht, der freut sich auf jeden Fall, der Fragesteller, auf Ihre Antwort. Und ich würde ja auch noch mal gleich an Ihrer Stelle sagen, von wegen die kleine Landtagsabgeordnete, die arme Landtagsabgeordnete, da finde ich, kann man ja gleich mal darauf reagieren. So arm finde ich das jetzt alles nicht.
Nee, ich finde mich jetzt auch nicht so arm und zumindest haben wir ja im Sachsen gerade keine Regierung, die eine Mehrheit hat, CDU und SPD, sondern sie angewiesen ist, dass Bündnis 90 Die Grünen mit ihren 7 kleinen Abgeordneten, die dann doch ganz groß werden, wenn es um Haushalt geht und um andere Dinge, doch eine wichtige Rolle spielen, das gemeinsam auch mit den Linken tun, um da auch sehr deutlich zu machen, dass es in diesem Landtag eben keine Mehrheiten mit der AfD gibt und BSW da an verschiedenen Stellen ja auch schon bewiesen hat, dass durch ihre Heterogenität dort und ihre Unverlässlichkeit da keine Mehrheiten zustande kommen. Also von daher wollte ich das an der Stelle beantworten. Aber natürlich, und darüber reden wir ja auch, muss und sollte Politik den Menschen ein Stück weit auch eine Vision und eine Hoffnung geben, die aber am Ende nicht auch übersteigert ist, sondern dass sie natürlich auch ganz konkret untersetzt ist. Aber das Gegenteil erleben wir in den verschiedenen Wahlkämpfen, die Sie beobachten, sei es auf Bundesebene, sei es auf Landesebene, dass es eben nicht darum geht oder nicht darum gegangen ist, eine positive Vision eines Freistaates Saxony that für den Kohleausstieg jetzt mit weiteren Geldern funds for abandoning brown coal, gemeinsam hinbekommen, sondern es negativ erzählt wird. Und the narrative is negative at the moment. Instead of thinking how we can shoulder the energy transition together, so without painting too positive a picture, we should really show that we have people who are full of energy. And we should capitalize on the positive energy with the politics that we are practicing. So politics doesn't mean that you go to the polls every few years, but that's really the big mistake that was made in the late 80s. You know, Biedenkopf in the front lines, you know, said, oh, we will look after you. You go to the polls and we will look after you. Instead, it should have been communicated that democracy and politics ask for the contribution of everybody. I think you know what I'm getting at. You know, when looking at the election results, we now have really ended up in a kind of democratic stalemate and inactivity. Well, talking about limits and borders, well, the lady in the background who I can't see anymore, I would like to answer as follows. I'm reasoning on a European level. If an Eastern European historian is confronted with a too rightist a perspective, it should be documented. Why is that so? Why does history have different weightings, and what tradition does this stem from? This will help to question and discuss your own position. This would be my appeal. If history is used
to polarize people. It could be as well used in order to see and listen to other perspectives. That means we are not the catalyzers of party politics. And then, of course, limits are seen in being hostile to the Constitution. This could be a certain limit. It certainly exists. Nonetheless, the potential of this multiplier activity has not yet been utilized. I think there is potential here. And a positive access, yes, this question can be asked about every interpretation. Europe can be seen as a series of wars, but after 1648, for example, efforts were made in order to organize a peaceful coexistence in Europe at different developmental levels. Thus, you can very well put the focus on a positive access, a positive stance, without, however, romanticizing or without creating heroes. Well, storytelling, facts-based talks, well, that's a certain aspect.
Können wir es mal kurz so stehen lassen, weil es kam jetzt auch ein bisschen auch in Ihrer Einlassung auch vor, dass Storytelling eine Rolle spielt. Vorhin hatten wir es auch schon mal. Ich hoffe, der die
Storytelling could have a role to play.
Überblick verliere, ist mir da nicht
I can't remember who said this, but would you like to ask the very last question?
Sie hier. Genau.
Yes, you in the front row here.
Ja, Achim Saupe, ich bin
Achim
Mitorganisator der Konferenz.
I'm the co-organizer of this conference.
Genau, wir haben
oh, we were only in mail contact, in email contact. Yes.
Spannend und auch
It was a very exciting discussion full of perspectives.
Diskussion über Gaza mit unserem Thema nochmal anders verknüpfen.
And maybe we can link up the discussion about Gaza with our topic. When it comes to history, revisionism and AFD, we can ask where do anti-Semitism and racism come from? Where are they visible? And does history create effects that the NSU killings occurred? We haven't discussed this so far. So the core elements of fascism, we can also read it in the posters. Fascism never again. Maybe they are somewhat succumbed in and killed in the debates, and nonetheless they raise their heads again. So, how are traditions made, or how are things communicated underneath the surface? Well, the Research Association Value of the Past, that's our name, and apart from storytelling and stories and facts, we want to be an effective voice, like a critical awareness of history. This is a goal, and putting things into their respective context and give assistance for interpretation, discourse, and facts-based approaches. And when it comes to the positive discourse, we could ask, haven't we gone too far? Is a positive narrative enough? Because at the same time, we want to make aware and create an awareness for injustice. And then we can also talk about anti-Semitism and migration stories. Maybe this is a pitch for the next event, really. I think your question was not a concrete question for the panel, or anti-Semitism, racism. What is the connection? My impression was that you have to go a bit further. Or would the panel like to answer to that?
den Teilbereich, den wir uns jetzt hier
instead of summarizing the partial area that we were going to focus on, history revisionism from the far right. Well, this is part of my research. I mean, I was not turning against multi-perspective narrations. I'm even in favor. But in this Kubitschek speech, actually, you could see this, you know, from this commonplace truth, like it's a matter of perspective, and it all depends on the perspective and the interpretation. All these are commonplace statements. It all belongs to our toolbox. And then history, Holocaust, and guilt. This, again, is a historic fact, and then I'm becoming really conservative, you know, as opposed to my training background. Here you can't argue about it, and this is exactly the trick they're using. They're trying to negotiate this, and the core element of the right-wing history legend, it is anti-Semitic, and then the theft of history in the Germans, with the tool of using the Allied forces. And this is a very widespread narrative, you know, identity theft by losing the war. And this is in the guise of a multi-perspective approach. So the conclusion here of the panel is not the most positive one, but it very well concludes our debate. And after the official part, you have the possibility of discussing all the questions that have remained unanswered on the panel in a one-on-one setting. I would like to conclude this debate, but if the organizers want to say a few words of farewell, they're welcome to do so. Thank you for joining us.
Ich sage auch nur wirklich ein Wort, weil ich weiß, dass hier drin
I will only say one word because, well, it's really becoming very warm in this room. We have got a few refreshments outside, and
wenn jemand ihre Meinung
I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, and if you'd like to voice your opinion, you are welcome to make comments or drop us a few lines.
Wir werden auf jeden Fall die Diskussion fortsetzen.
And we look forward to discussing the debate. Thank you.